All right. So thanks everybody for joining me. As mentioned, my name's Stephen Valdinger, Stevie Coaster, as you will find me online everywhere, LinkedIn, Blue Sky, all the places, GitHub. I go by Stevie Coaster online. I work for Chocolaty, same as James, customer solutions engineer at Chocolaty Software. So I make sure that all of our customers are using the product in the way that they need to and mean to. And when they have issues, that we are fixing those issues really, really quickly. PowerShell is central to what we do at Chocolaty. So I'm very, very into it. I love PowerShell. And one of the things that's interesting to me is the various ways that you can use PowerShell. Um, PowerShell GUIs are not something that are new. PowerShell GUIs have been around for a very, very long time. Most of us in the room here are probably familiar with Sapien's PowerShell Studio suite of tools that gives you an IDE for building PowerShell GUIs and associated tooling. They have a whole suite of tools that can do more than just GUIs. They do help and just scripts and all different kinds of things. There is PowerShell Universal from Adam Driscoll. That's another super super popular one. That's probably my favorite all around uh, PowerShell development platform. Particularly if you're looking for friendly UIs, it's web based. You can do a whole bunch of stuff inside of PowerShell Universal. It's really really great. There are a couple of other interesting tools out there that used to be open source but no longer are open source. Poshgui.com is one of them. Um, that's relatively easy to use. It's a drag and drop editor that allows you to drag and drop components onto a form, and then it works to give you the code back, and you take it and you run it. The one that we're going to talk about today in this session is the newest thing out there. This is WinUI Shell, a PowerShell module written by MDGRS. That's what it goes by online. He is a game developer from Japan by day, and he is a PowerShell wizard by night. He's got some really really cool stuff. This WinUI Shell module that he's created wraps the WinUI 3 80K. So all of the modern Windows application elements that we're familiar with in Windows 10 and Windows 11. It's that framework that we're going to be using to build these applications. So the GitHub repository up here on my screen, github.com, MDGRSK, WinUI Shell. I'm going to put this in the chat so that everybody can have it. This is the home of this PowerShell module. He's got a couple of examples of UIs here right in the README. There's a little quick start and then some kind of explainer stuff as you go through it. And then if you look, there's an examples folder, which has a bunch of different examples of all the controls that you can currently use within the module. Not everything that's available in the toolkit from Microsoft is available as a component that you can use in the module. There are a ton of controls that you can use. And as this is a brand new thing, he's just not got all of the controls added yet. He's working on it. I expect that this will continue to grow and he will add more and more and more over time. But right now, there are only a limited amount of tools that you can use to add to your GUI applications that you're going to write. So we're going to step right into looking at some code. I don't do slides. I don't do any of that. We're just going to open up VS Code and explore what putting together a UI using this module really looks like. So without further ado, I'm going to step over here and open my VS Code up. Um, we're going to start kind of backwards, right? So if we take a look in my scripts folder, we've got a couple of different ways to do the same thing. So In this script, which is just a PowerShell script, we are converting a certificate and a key into a PFX file because a PFX file is essentially a fancy zip file, right? It's got the certificate and the key associated with that certificate bundled together into a PFX. So when you install it, you basically unzip it into a Windows store and you're good to go, or on your Linux box or whatever. So PFX file, fancy zip file, that's what this script does. And because there is no certutil.exe way to make a PFX file from a cert and its associated key, you need to rely on .NET methods to do that work, which we can see here. So we load a certificate, we load the private key, we create the certificate with the private key. This basically creates the artifact that we write to our PFX file. It's all the script does, but it's very PowerShell way to do it, right? It- it's just a script. You would need to run it like you run any other PowerShell script, provide parameters on the command line. The script runs, it does what it needs to do, and you're on to the next thing, right? There are other ways to do the same kind of work, and another example is using openssl.exe, or if you're on Linux, just openssl, the binary. With the appropriate parameters, it does the same thing. You give it a cert, you give it a key, it spits out a PFX file. So there are options for you when you're writing your PowerShell with what tool you're going to use to do the work. But all of these require you to know how to run a PowerShell script, right? Like you as an administrator need to open up PowerShell. You need to call the PowerShell script in the appropriate way. You need to pass the parameters correct and cross your fingers that you typed everything correctly or pasted everything correctly and that it works. That's fine for those of us that are tech savvy system administrators, engineers, DevOps people, developers, like those of us that are super familiar and comfortable with PowerShell, this is a fine way to work. The next iteration of this is to develop tools that anybody can use, right? We want people that aren't as tech savvy or don't know PowerShell as much or have no desire to learn PowerShell be able to run the tools that we're writing. The best way to do that, in my opinion, is to create a UI and give them access to that UI. That's where tools like WinUI Shell come into play. We can create a really, really graphically beautiful interface that runs the code that we see here in these scripts, but is more pointy, clicky, typey, button clicky type stuff, right? That's just more user friendly for more people to be able to use your tool. So if we take a look at this OpenSSL way.ps1, this is how, as a PowerShell developer, we would write this script and then we would execute this script. As a PowerShell developer that wants to create a UI for somebody to be able to fill in information and click a button, the script needs to morph. We need to add those controls. Now, the nice thing about WinUI Shell is that it's just a PowerShell module. So the way we write PowerShell today doesn't really have to change. If we look at the new simple OpenSSL example here, this is the same exact code from the old OpenSSL way.ps1 file, just wrapped in the stuff that makes it a GUI that people can run. So if we look at this one, and I'll just show you what it looks like before we dive into it here. So we'll say new simple, and we'll run that one. And we get this really nice UI that folks can run, right? So we can supply our certificate file, we can supply our key file, we can supply where we want the PFX file to be saved to, and then optionally, we can have a password on the PFX. So if I were to come over here, let me just go grab one. Open cert path. That'll work. That's fine. If I take the, and I know you guys can't see this, so let me put this over here. If I take this cert file, for example, and I say copy as path, and I take this key file, and I say copy as path, and then I need a place to store this. So let me see if I've got a temp directory on my C drive. I do. And let me get rid of an old example. So we'll do C temp. Let's call this london.pfx, and we'll just make the export password uh, something silly like London. Fine, whatever. Now you'll notice that the password is actually a password box. It masks the input. Now, when you use a password box, it does store the value as a secure string. So it is relatively good, right? It's doing good things that you would expect a PowerShell script to do. It's not just masking something and storing it as plain text. So you do have to handle it appropriately if you need to work with that plain text value. But when I click convert, it says done, and I go over here and there's my PFX file. That's really, really user friendly. And the way that I did this is 100% PowerShell. Now, it might look a little weird, and we're going to step through it. So, those of you that might not be familiar with type accelerators and .NET classes and things like that in PowerShell, we're going to take a step back and kind of explain it really, really slowly and kind of add the building blocks as we go. And I'm going to leave this UI up as we step through the code so that we have something as a frame of reference so that as I'm explaining something, I can highlight it in the UI to show you where we should be looking. So the first thing that we're going to do when we start writing this stuff is importing the module. Now, because the support for classes in PowerShell isn't as strong as it is if you were to do this just natively in C sharp, we need to use a using statement at the top of our PowerShell script to enable all of the classes to load properly so that the module works the way that it should. Because all of these, like this application class that we're using here, technically it's WinUI Shell dot application. That using statement at the top allows us to just call the actual type off of the namespace for WinUI Shell. So that's what that using statement is doing at the very top of our script if you're not familiar with it. In a later example, when we look at how you can make this more quote unquote PowerShelly, we'll show you how you can move that stuff around when you're making a module so that it's not at the top of every script that you're going to be running. So the very, very first thing we do is actually this can go away. I forgot to delete it, but we load up our WinUI Shell stuff. We make sure everything's available to us in the script, and then we start building our app. So we need some resources, and this is technically our application itself. So we need to create a new app. So we need a new application, and we need the resources for that application. So we define that, and then we need a window to show our app in, right? So the very first thing, we create an app, we get all of its resources, and then we create the window that we're going to start painting. And you can kind of think or you can kind of think of a window for the app as the canvas. So pretend we're an artist as we go down through here, and we're going to paint a picture as we develop our application. So we've got our canvas, our window, and the next thing we're going to do is we're going to prepare our canvas a little bit. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Bob Ross. So over here in the US, for those maybe in Europe that aren't super familiar, Bob Ross, very fancy or very famous painter, had a TV show on public television for a, a ton of years, very well known American icon. Um, he painted happy little trees all the time. And what he did initially, a lot of the time, was he covered his canvas in like white paint to start blank canvas, but he painted the thing white and then he added paint over top of that. We can consider the backdrop painting the canvas white or black or whatever color you're going to paint it. There are a whole bunch of these different backdrops that you can use. I actually there's not a whole bunch. There's only like 2 or 3 of them. But the mica backdrop is what gives it this black color for our UI. So we want a nice dark theme backdrop. There's a backdrop that you can use that follows the system, and then there's a light theme as well. So there's technically 3. And then what we want to do is we want to extend the app into the title bar. So that makes it so there's no line between where the title bar stops and where the main content of the app starts. So if you hover over the X here, you can kind of see where the red of the X stops. Imagine drawing a line all the way across that. Everything above that line is a title bar. So by setting extend content into title bar, we just kind of bleed everything up into the title. So it flows as one cohesive unit. It looks really, really nice that way. The next thing that we need to do is we provide an overlay. And this overlay is where all of the GUI elements are going to sit. So once we have our canvas painted, we can start adding stuff to our canvas. And the first thing that we're going to paint is a landscape, right? So we can kind of think of our presenter as our landscape. And then we can control the size of the app as well. For this one, I decided that 410 pixels this way by 505 or 555 pixels tall made sense. And there's no option to resize this in this particular example. You can set the app to be able to resize and things of that nature, but I wanted a very static tool that it would always look good for people when they're using it. It wouldn't confuse them in any way. So that's what we do to kind of get started with our application. And then we start to add elements onto the application, onto our canvas. The first thing that we're going to put onto our canvas is an icon. And for this example, I couldn't find like a great icon that really conveyed converting one thing to another, but I thought a wrench kind of worked because we're working on something. So what I've done is I've selected the repair icon from the symbol icon enum to be our icon. So we set our icon, and then we need a text block for our title at the very top of our app. And that's where we set this PFX file maker thingy. So these are the first 2 components that we're going to paint onto our canvas, that we're going to put onto our app. Now, the way that we can kind of control how things look and where they're placed onto the app is with this thing called a stack panel. So inside of this first stack panel, I want to place my icon and my text block. And I don't want them to be icon and then text underneath. I want the icon to be beside the text. So in my stack panel that I create right here, I want the orientation for this panel to be horizontal instead of vertical. And I also want the spacing between the items in the panel to be 16 pixels. And then I want other components that are going to start and be around this panel to have a certain margin. That I want a certain amount of distance between them. So I've set my margins to be 0, 12, 0, and 24. I don't remember off the top of my head the order, but I think it's top, left, right, bottom. But don't quote me on that for what the order is. Later in the presentation, when we turn this stuff into more of a tool that you can use, um, the order of the parameters is correct. So we'll be able to explain what the order of this stuff is a little later. But for now, the point is we've got a margin, and that's the amount of space that is around a particular component in our GUI app as we're developing it. So in the case of our panel at the top that's holding our wrench and our title, we have a certain margin before any of the other components load onto the UI. Once we have this first stack panel created, we need to add the rest of our UI components onto our app. The first thing that we're going to add is a text box to allow people to enter the certificate path. So that's what we do with this certificate here. We just create a new text box. We give it a header, which tells people what we expect, and we give placeholder text. So if I were to come in here and take this out, the placeholder text shows up when there's nothing that you've typed into the box. So in this case, we are telling people that you can either use a .cer file type or a .cert file type. Those are the two certificate files that are accepted into this field. Similar thing with the key file. It's exactly the same thing. It's a text box. The header is different because obviously this is a different thing that we're asking for. And then for the placeholder text, I'm telling the end user that you can provide a .key file. Anything else is going to cause a problem. Now you'll notice there's no validation here. We'll get to that later. And again, we want to set a margin. In this case, I want 24 pixels between the bottom of this item and the top of the next item to kind of give it a nice even spacing. Again, we're going to have a text box for the PFX file. Where are we going to save the PFX file to? That shows up here. We have one for the password box, which is a different type. Again, password box is the type there. We have a margin, and you kind of rinse and repeat. Now, there is a status box right here where it says done. Because we've already run this, we can see the status box. By default, the status box doesn't say anything because we want it to be hidden. We don't want the status to show anything once the app first opens. We're going to control what this says as whatever we're doing runs. So we create a blank status, we paint it onto our canvas, and then we move on to the next element, which is going to be the button. Buttons are probably one of the hardest things to wrap your head around with the simple form, just because of what they are and how they work. So a button itself, pretty easy in that it's just a button class. You can give it alignment. Where do you want the text to be aligned inside of the button? Do you want the text centered in the button, to the left, to the right? How do you want that to look? What do you want the button to say? So in this example, the content of the button says convert. Right now it says close. If I were to close this and rerun it so that we can see it brand new, you'll notice we don't have that status anymore. It's gone. And our button says convert. So initially, we want that button to say convert. And then we want to give it a style. And this is where we start to use the resources that we picked up at the very top from our application. In the application itself, there's some stylistic things that come along for the ride with it. And one of the things is the style of the button that gets painted onto the GUI. So in this case, we are going to select the accent button style out of the resources dictionary. And that is going to give us this nice blue button here. Now, I wish I could tell you how to discover all of the available options inside of this resources from a very PowerShelly perspective, but it's not super easy. So the way that I'm going to tell you to do it is to look for the application class and then drill into the current resources documentation on the Microsoft Docs, and then follow that to um, the dictionary for the resources, and it's everything is documented in there. It's just not super easy to get to from a PowerShell perspective here while you're using the code here directly. And again, once you've got the button kind of put on the screen where you want, and you've got the style how you want it, and you've got the text how you want it, we need the button to actually do something, right? Now, to make the button actually do something, we need to use this add click method, which accepts a script block. So if you're not super familiar with the way this works, it's similar to doing a validate script when you're defining a parameter. So it's just code that runs or a script block that executes when you click the button. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to pick up a variable that we set outside of the button. So if you look, we've got this press to close variable set to false. So if it's true, so if this button is true, what we're going to do is just close the form, right? That's what we want to do. So by setting it false, nothing's going to happen initially when we click the button with the form. It's going to stay open. We're going to change that state later on as kind of the last step. Now, I do have one other component type on this form, but this is a really, really, really bad example to use with this component. I probably should have done this a little bit different. The reason it's really really bad is this process is really, really fast. It's so fast that the progress ring doesn't have time to paint itself onto the form before it's done and the status box takes over. But this progress ring thing, all it is a spinny circle that while the script is running, while the conversion to a PFX file is in progress, you've got a spinny circle. And that's what we're doing here. We're just setting that progress ring to active. As soon as you click the button for converting, it starts that circle spinning, and then we disable the button so you can't click it again accidentally while the conversion process is in play. The next thing we do is we need to define our arguments for the OpenSSL executable. That's done here in this array. So we're saying, hey, run this subcommand with these parameters. We're going to export something. We're giving you the certificate, and we're going to pick up the value of that certificate from the certificate text box here. And it doesn't like quotes, does not like them. So I'm using some PowerShell inside of here. So when you do a copy as path, it puts double quotes around it. I'm making it so the end user doesn't have to think about that. So if you've given me double quotes, I just strip them off. That way you don't have to think about it. Just put it in here with them, without them. I don't care. It's going to work no matter what you do. Same thing with the key. We're going to pick up that key and do the same conversion. We're going to pick up the file for the PFX that we want to use and provide that to the out parameter. And then again with the password. And similar, I mentioned earlier that the password is actually a secure string, so we can do proper PowerShell things with it. I'm just using a network credential object here to get the password as plain text to pass to the native command for OpenSSL, because OpenSSL wants a plain text password. Once I have my arguments for OpenSSL defined in a try catch blocks, I start a log so that my attempt to do the conversion is logged somewhere. And then I run the OpenSSL command with my conversion arguments. And then I set my status.text to that done thing. And that is what makes it show up down here. If I've got an error, I set my status.text to the exception itself. And then I stop my transcript. And then I turn off all the things. I turn my progress ring off so it stops the spinny circle. I set the content of the button to close. So once I've made my conversion, I can close my app. And then I set the press to close variable to true. So the next time I push my button after I've done a conversion and we get to this block of code, this is now true. So it closes my window. So that's how I'm controlling the state of closing the app when I'm done with it. A little convoluted, but that's how it works. And again, I can enable that button. So once it says closed, you can actually click it. Otherwise, it will say closed and it doesn't matter. You can click it all day long. It's not going to do anything. So that is how I've defined my button. Now, up until this point, all I've done is defined the elements that are going to be painted onto my canvas, that are going to be part of my UI. Now I actually have to put them onto the UI, and I'm going to use a second stack panel to do that. So down here at the bottom, I'm going to add all of the components that I want to show up onto the form as children of the stack panel in the correct order. So immediately after my icon and my title, I want my title panel. Well, this is a panel within a panel. So the very first thing I want to put on my canvas is my icon and my title. So I add that panel that I created earlier, just so I have a single container. You can do this a bunch of different ways. I opted to do it this way, in that I've got a panel for my title and my icon, and then I've got a bunch of text boxes and password boxes that I add to this panel. I've got my button and my progress ring and my status bar that I add to this panel. And then I set the content of the window to my panel. So once I do this and I activate it, my app opens and it shows up and I get a painted picture that we can actually use. And then this very last thing, wait for close, it's a blocking call, meaning this PowerShell session just sits here. I can't do anything with it until this window gets closed. Now, you can like come in here and comment that out, and let me save that and run this again. Now I get my thing back, and by getting my thing back, I can look and see the button on on the form, right? So this is the button object. Um, so now I can do something like button dot content equals hi London, and I can run that, and the button will update. So you can, while you're developing things, just not use the window when wait for closed method, and then you can get at the individual components that are on the form and change them and tweak them. And then when you're done, if you want to make it so somebody can't accidentally screw themselves over, tell them to wait for closed. So I'm going to pause there because I talked for a really long time and said a lot of words, and I might have confused a whole lot of people. So I think I can't see the stage or the room or anything like that, unless there's a way for me to like change my view here. But if anybody's got questions, I think there's a QA thing at the front of the room. You can walk up to that, and then I'll be able to see you and hear you and answer any questions. And
Yeah,
while
anyone's curious,
well,
you've
there
got
we go.
map view or meeting view.
I just found the map view button. Yes. I see Gilbert has walked up to the mic.
So I sent a message for a tool that's in the Microsoft Store that actually shows you some of these components. Because I agree. I think the tool is awesome in that it makes it really easy to build. But I think the discovery of those things is kind of tricky. So
Right.
I really wish I saved the name somewhere. But I think it's if you look up WinUI in the Microsoft Store, there's just a tool that shows you those different components. So if you're looking for stuff like that, that's pretty helpful.
Nice. Very cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, I know he's working to add more components that the module supports. He's just not got everything in there yet because there's freaking hundreds of the dumb things, radio buttons and drop down menus, and the list goes on and on and on and on of all the stuff that you can actually use from Microsoft in the framework. It's just a matter of moving it over and turning it into something that the PowerShell module can consume. Any other questions or anything? I do want to show one other aspect of this. We've done a lot here in defining a UI, but it's been less PowerShelly than we might be used to. And I say PowerShelly meaning not very verb noun like we're used to, like get process or new item or something like that, where we have a function that we run with a bunch of parameters. The way this thing is built is it is a framework. You can use it directly, like I am using here, in that I can create instances of objects, which is what this presenter is, or what this icon is, or what this title panel is, or what this text box is. This text cert variable is an instance of a text box object. And an object has properties on it. So then we can just set those properties by saying dot header equal to whatever we want the header to be, the placeholder, et cetera, et cetera. That's not super PowerShelly. So what you could do is something like what I've started to do here with WinUI Shell.utils. So if we take a quick look into this module that I'm starting on, we can start to see that we've got PowerShell functions that we can start to use. So new UI text box has a header parameter. It has a placeholder parameter. It has a margin parameter that are strongly typed. So the header is a string, the placeholder is a string, the margin is a thickness object. So that if you accidentally put the wrong thing in here, the PowerShell parameters gonna barf all over the place and be like, I don't know what you're trying to do. I need this type of thing. So we can start to leverage the goodies that PowerShell gives us to start building tooling around the framework that is WinUI Shell. So in this example here, this new UI text box, all we're doing is creating an instance of that text box. And let me see if can I do this? Yeah. So when we do this, we create an instance of the text box here. We set the header property to whatever the parameter was for the header. If you've given us a placeholder, we're going to set that. And if you've given us a margin, we're going to set that. And then we return our text box. So instead of all of this here, this now becomes something like new UI text box with a header of something, a placeholder, I can't talk, of X, and then a margin of, let's just use M and pretend that the M variable is a margin that we've set earlier. So instead of doing all this stuff that looks potentially unfamiliar and unfriendly, now we've got a tool that is very familiar and very friendly and can have more error handling built into it if you want to. So you can throw errors if the input's not correct. You can do all the stuff that you can do in PowerShell inside of this function. So I wanted to have this completely done to the point where I could be like, we just ran through this the hard way. Here's the same exact thing, the easy way with a lot less lines of code. But I got the idea to do this at like 10:30 p.m. last night, and I needed to sleep and also work before I came and gave this presentation. So I knocked together what I could, but there's still some warts in a couple of different places with things either needing to be mandatory or things being the wrong type for what the property expects. And there's just a bunch of cleanup that I need to do. And there's a bunch of additional UI components that actually need functions. So I'm going to keep working on this thing after this presentation's over and over the next couple of days, and get this polished up real nice, get some docs for it. And then I'm going to release this as a module myself to the PowerShell gallery. So you'll be able to install the WinUI Shell.utils module and give you a more PowerShell way to develop these GUIs. So look for that in the future. But the point to make there is that you can take this framework that is WinUI Shell and then start to build your own tooling around it. And your own tooling might be, you might create a base GUI that looks and feels the same for a whole bunch of different stuff. And then you build on top of that in your other tools. So you might have a GUI that just has an icon and a title in it, and that's your starting framework. You might have new Fabricam app as your function, and it spits out this GUI that has nothing on it but, the wrench icon and the title, and then you add to that after you've got that app. Scaffold it out or whatever. So all kinds of stuff you can do with this thing. The world is your oyster, et cetera, et cetera. Use your imagination. This tool is going to get better and better. This framework is going to get better and better as they add more and more components to the module and support more things. One thing that I think I am going to help them do is create some documentation around the different components, have like individual like component documentation pages. So there'll be a doc for the text box component or a doc for the progress string component, etc. The examples are really good. They do a pretty good job of showing off what it can do, but I think there's some work that can be done to explain all the individual pieces and parts to each component to help you pick and choose what you're going to use and pick and choose how you're going to style it and how it's going to look, etc.